Hi everyone, welcome back to part 2 of my 5-part quilting series. I will link video number 1 up here if you haven't seen that one. In the last video I talked about tools and choosing your design for your quilt, and today I'm going to talk about fabric. Now, it's easy to get caught up in all of the beautiful fabrics that are available, the gorgeous designs, new trends, and to go to the quilting store or the fabric shop and buy fabric off the bolt or pre-cut fabric for quilting, but that can be quite expensive. So bear in mind where quilting came from. Quilting started as a way to use up scraps of fabric and clothing that had been worn out, to take the good pieces from that clothing and to make something new from it. So it doesn't have to be expensive to make a quilt. When you're choosing fabric, if you're going into a quilting store and buying fabric specifically designed for quilting, it's going to be cotton, and it's going to be fabric like this. This is a fat quarter. You can buy quilting fabric off the roll. You can buy it pre-cut as fat quarters, which I'll talk about in a minute. You can buy them in jelly rolls, which are 2.5 by 5 inch strips of fabric, and they're all designed to coordinate with each other, and they're sold in a roll, so you can use that to create your own design of quilt, but most of the work is done for you. Or you can use old clothing or go to the thrift store and find clothes there, or find sheets there, or something that you can cut up to create your quilt. It doesn't have to be brand new fabric. I would be wary of the weight though. If you look at quilting fabric, it is a medium weight cotton fabric. It's not particularly thick and heavy like an upholstery fabric would be. It doesn't have ridges like corduroy. It's not slippery like silk. It's just basic fabric. So when you're building a quilt, I wouldn't mix in too many weights of fabric, because it's going to be difficult to work with and it may not wash and wear evenly. I have created quilts with solely quilting fabric. There's a quilt top behind me. It's not actually a quilt, it's just a top. I haven't actually completed it. This was the first quilting project that I attempted, and that is made with quilting fabric. But I have made quilts using thrifted items and using just odds and ends of fabric that I had lying around. For example, this baby quilt that I showed you in last week's video. On the front we have a lightweight fabric. We have quilting fabrics. That one was a quilting fat quarter that I bought, so was that, so was that. This was a thrifted piece of fabric, and the back was actually some curtains that I thrifted, just polycotton curtains, and I've used that fabric to back it. When choosing your fabric, you want to think about your design of quilt. So the quilt behind me that you see is a queen size quilt. Well, it's not a quilt, like I said, it's just the top, but it's made up of big blocks. So I could choose a bolder design. For example, this red and white polka dot. If I had used that fabric on the quilt that I showed you, the baby quilt, it wouldn't have had the same effect because the design would have been broken up by the strips. So if you're making a quilt with very small blocks or strips, you don't really want to choose a big bold fabric, especially if it's like a big flower or something, because that's not going to show. So do bear in mind the finished size of your blocks when choosing your fabric. It also pays to have a mix of scales. So if you have different blocks where all of the patterns are a small scale pattern, that's fine. That's a creative choice that you can make, but just be aware of that choice. Some people prefer to have some small scale florals, like let's say you're making a quilt with florals. You might want to have small scale florals, large scale florals, and medium scale florals. You may decide not to have a pattern at all and just to use solid colors of fabric. That's totally fine as well. That is the beauty of quilting. You can make any color combination you like, any pattern combination you like, and as long as it pleases your eye, it's perfect. There's no right or wrong. Okay, so I said I would talk about what a fat quarter is. If you go to the shop and buy fabric on a roll, this is how it will appear. They will roll out the fabric, and let's say you want 1/4 meter. They're going to cut in a long strip, and you're going to have a long piece of fabric that is 1/4 meter. Whatever the width of the fabric is, the length that you've bought is 1/4 meter. Now a fat quarter is when they roll out 1 meter of fabric, cut that off, and then they cut it in half vertically and in half horizontally. So you still have 1/4 meter, but it's a fat quarter. It's not a long skinny quarter. That's why it's called a fat quarter. Fat quarters are an awesome way of building up your stash or getting bits and pieces for a quilt, because if you're having a mix of designs and colors in your quilt, you don't necessarily want to buy a whole ton of that fabric in each color. So you can go to the shop and you can pick out a few fat quarters, and you know that they're going to coordinate because you can lay them out together, and you're going to have enough for your quilt, possibly some scraps left over, but you're not going to have all these bolts and bolts of fabric. And if you're choosing a design with big blocks, for example, you might not want a long quarter strip. You might want to cut a different design out of that block, so a fat quarter is more practical for that reason. As I mentioned, you can buy jelly rolls. This is what a jelly roll looks like. Most quilting stores or fabric stores will have these, and they're all picked out, they match, they coordinate. You can split up jelly rolls and take some of the fabric out and match it up with a different jelly roll or fabric that you've bought, off a roll, or other fat quarters that you've bought. Obviously you can do what you want with it, but the idea is to make coordinating a quilt easy. There are plenty of jelly roll quilt designs, so if you just Google that or search on Pinterest, there's books about them, and they're quilts designed using jelly rolls, but they're all different designs that you can put together with those strips of fabric, which are 2.5 by 5 inches. You can also do things like go onto Etsy and buy fabric there. You can buy it off the roll, you can buy it as fat quarters or jelly rolls, or some sellers have actually coordinated fabrics together and already cut them into squares or already cut them into triangles or whatever you're looking for. That takes away so much of the work of a quilt if you can just buy your squares or buy your shapes and then sew it together, or choose a different sashing fabric to go between them and put your design together. So that's somewhere to look as well if you don't want the kind of manufactured coordinated fabrics that you would get, for example, in a jelly roll. You want something a little bit more curated. There are Etsy sellers who do that. If you're buying brand new fabric, you're going to have to prepare your fabric. You want to wash and dry it, which I will show you how to do that. If you're buying thrifted fabric for your quilt, whether it's clothing or something like a sheet, that work's already done for you. It's already been washed and shrunk. Obviously you want to wash it again to make sure it's clean, but you know that it's not going to shrink and the colors aren't going to run. So that's an advantage if, for example, you are making a quilt with red and white in it. You don't want to build this beautiful quilt, wash it and have the red bleed all over. Now when buying thrifted items, bear in mind the design of your quilt. If I'm making a quilt like this with big blocks and I buy a shirt to cut up, I'm only going to get a couple of big blocks out of that shirt. You have to take into account the fact that there's seams, the fact that if you're cutting fabric off a sleeve, it's going to probably have a line there where it's been flattened and ironed. There's going to be pockets, there's going to be buttons, so you're probably going to get less fabric out of an item like that unless you're working with very small pieces. Something like a bed skirt is my favorite thing to quilt with because that fabric is pristine. Because if you think about it, with the bed skirt, you see the skirt part, but the part that goes underneath the mattress has never been faded, it's never been worn, it's pristine fabric. So that is perfect fabric to quilt with. And I like to use fabric like that or thrifted flat sheets for the backs of my quilts or for the sashing and in-between parts. For example, with this quilt, the white is all from a thrifted flat sheet. Choosing your colors for your quilt, you can find inspiration on Pinterest or in photographs or magazines. Anywhere that you see a picture that the colors please you, pick out those colors and use that in a quilt if you like. Or you can start with a lead fabric. Now this quilt, the one that I just showed you and the one that was the background for last week's video, my lead fabric was this one. And this fabric came from a shirt that Noah, my youngest son, wore when he was around 2. So here are a couple of photos of him in this shirt. He looked so trendy and so adorable, and I wanted to use that shirt in a quilt. So that was, like I said, my lead fabric. So what a lead fabric does is it leads you into your color choices. So this fabric has a mix of pale blue, brown, pink and green, and so those are the fabric colors that I picked out for my design. I have brown, I have that brown, I have the pink with little bits of brown, I've got a couple of shades of blue, some is plain, some is patterned, I have a couple of shades of green. It's good to have a mix of light and dark and a mix of pattern and plain. Then I just laid it out into what I felt was a balanced design and that pleased my eye, and then I separated the blocks with white sashing. For the back of this quilt I actually used I think it's called a voile. It's this pattern fabric which pulled together all of the colors of my quilt, which I thought was just perfect. You can see the back and the front together there. but it's a very lightweight fabric, and I didn't want it to kind of wear through or have any problems when I came to quilt it, so I double layered it. So this is actually a layer of this fabric and then a layer of white fabric behind it, just to give it a bit of strength. And then you have the batting in between, which we'll get to later when we come to sandwich our quilt. Okay, I mentioned washing your fabric before you start. If you buy brand new fabric, you want to give it a quick wash and dry before you begin your quilt. This will do two things. It will take off any excess dye and starches that they have on the fabric, and it will also make sure that it's pre-shrunk so that you don't sew your quilt, wash it, and then have the pieces shrink and have your quilt pulling in different areas. Now, when you buy fabric off a roll or in a block or whatever, if you throw that into your washing machine, put it through a wash and spin cycle and dry it, you can have all kinds of pulled threads on the edges, and it's going to be a bit of a nightmare. I don't think a full cycle in the washing machine is even necessary. What I tend to do is give it a swish in some warm water with a tiny bit of washing powder, give it a rinse, squeeze it out, and then just let it air dry. And then my last tip when it comes to fabric is storing it in between use. Not all of us have the luxury of time to just sit down and create a quilt from start to finish, and you may end up having to put your things away to come back to later. Now, you don't want to bundle up your fabric and put it away in a drawer or a box and then have to repress all of it afterwards. So I tend to hang my fabric over a clothes hanger and put it into a closet. It's so much easier to store that way. It stays wrinkle free, it stays out of the way, it's not big and bulky to store. You can find a slot in a closet somewhere, and so that is how I store fabric in between quilting sessions. As I mentioned in the first video of this series, I'm going to be making a quilt along with these videos and demonstrating the things that I've just talked about. So now I'm going to show you the fabric that I've picked out for my friend's baby's quilt, and I'm going to prepare it, and I'm going to show you how I store it. These are the fabrics that I've chosen to make the quilt with. This is a thrifted piece of fabric. I've already washed that. This used to be a flat sheet. This is a brand new piece of fabric, so I'll need to wash that. This is a brand new fat quarter. I'll need to wash that. This has already been washed. It's got a bit of a stain there, but this was a piece of sheeting. This has already been washed. This is all out of my stash. Ditto this. This has been washed. It's a shirt. You can see there, I've already cut it up and used pieces of it. So that's been washed. This is also a thrifted shirt, and that's already been washed. This is a thrifted flat sheet. I've washed that. That's a piece of fabric out of my stash that's been washed. And then this is what I'm going to use for the back, and it's a brand new flat sheet, and that hasn't been washed, so I also need to wash that. This being just a finished off flat sheet, I'll just chuck into the washing machine, but these two I will show you how I hand wash them. Okay, I'm in my laundry room and I have this plastic tub in the sink, so I'm going to run some hot water and just let that get warm. I don't want the water to be super hot, I just want it to be warm. I'm going to run some of that in, and I'm going to put in a little bit of soap powder, but only like about a teaspoon. We're not going to need much water. Okay, so I have two fabrics and one is lighter than the other. You want to start with your lightest fabric. Let's say you're doing 5 different fabrics. Start with your lightest, then go on to the second lightest, etc. You don't want to start with a red fabric, for example, and have that dye bleed into the water. The water becomes pink. You put your next color in and then that gets tinted pink. So any dye that's going to come off, obviously you're going to do better if you start light and then move on to dark. So I'm just going to put the fabric in. See, that's the size of a fat quarter. This one is 50 by 52 centimeters. I'm just going to make sure that the water gets all the way through. That's literally all you need to do. I'm going to rinse it in a minute. Now I'm going to do the grey. I got a bigger piece of the grey because I'm going to use it for another project as well. Okay, take your fabric out and tip out your water and then run some clean water in. I'm just going to run cold. You can obviously do this directly into your sink, but my sink's a bit gross and I don't have a plug, so that's why I use a plastic tub. So I'm just going to rinse it to make sure that there's no soap powder in it. Give it a good squeeze. And then I can hang and dry that. That's it. Super quick and easy. I'm just going to air dry the fabric on my laundry drying rack. Oops. As for the rest of the fabric, I haven't pressed it yet, but I'm still going to store it on a hanger, so I've just laid them all out flat on a hanger underneath, and that can get stored all together in one go in a closet somewhere. I hope you found this video helpful. If you haven't seen the first video, I'd go back and watch that. If you want to quilt along with me, then you have a week before the next video to go and pick out and prepare your own fabric for your quilt. I hope to see you back again next week. I will link the playlist down below, and once it is live, I will link the next video here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.